Welcome to the UCL Lunch Hour Lectures. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Peter Rees from the Bartlett School of Planning. He's a professor of places and city planning and was a city planning officer for the City of London and led the planning and regeneration of this world business and financial center from 1985 to 2014. His lunch hour lecture today is entitled Places equals Spaces plus People. Welcome to all of you.
Well, hello. As you would expect from the university that is #1 in the league of research power in the country, having rapidly overtaken Oxford and Cambridge, this is a state-of-the-art lecture theatre. It's equipped with the ability to show DVDs, to show PowerPoint presentations. It even has surround sound and the ability to display holograms. And you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to use any of that today. All I'm going to use are my hands, my voice, and the pictures you've brought with you in your own minds, because you already have the images of place that I need to work with. I must remember that today I'm not only addressing you as an audience here in the Darwin Theatre, but also an audience at home, an audience sitting somewhere else. You are in the here and now, they are in the there and now, and indeed there will be those that will be viewing this lecture online at some time in the future who are in the there and then. So all three audiences are coming together at this point, but not necessarily at this time. And I think about the internet version of the lecture as being a bit like a message in a bottle, bobbing around in an ocean of porn on the internet. And messages in bottles, sooner or later, wash up on a beach. And that's where we're going to start. Now, the beach I'm thinking of is in the far west of Wales, facing the Atlantic. You may have other beaches in mind, but the beach has to be broad, it has to be sandy, and it has to have cliffs around the back and sides of the bay. The problem is that it's not summer. So take the images out of your mind of going to the seaside or being somewhere tropical, lying under a palm tree. None of that nonsense. We're on a good bracing beach in the winter. The waves are crashing in, good surfing waves. And we're walking along the edge of the water on the wet sand, leaving footprints. Already, we are in place because we are at an edge. Human beings are desperate to know where they are, to be located. And going to the seaside, going to the edge of the sea, walking along the edge of the sea, leaving footprints in the sand, you are in place, you're on an edge. You at least know where you are in one dimension. You're on the land as opposed to the sea. And that's one of the reasons why, deep down, we're attracted to edges, to the sea, to the edge of a river, to places where we can locate ourselves. And of course, hopefully, leave a mark, even if it's only footprints in the sand. 10,000 years ago, most of the indigenous people of this country came via beaches like that. The Celts, the people who were here before the waves of immigrants from the Romans to the Romanians who make up the people who call themselves the English, before they arrived, us Celts, we arrived mainly by sea. Remember, there'd been just a tad of global warming 10,000 years ago, and the sea levels had risen 300 feet. You think we've got problems today? The English Channel had been formed by landslides in Norway, and well, it was a sort of a UKIP weather forecast, really. We'd separated ourselves from the French at last. But in this island, around the edges, on the beaches, the Celts were coming ashore. They'd come up from Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, heaven knows why. I mean, if you've got a choice of Spanish beaches or the beaches of West Wales, I know which ones I'd choose. Nevertheless, they'd come north and they'd landed on the beaches. The first thing they needed was shelter. Shelter and protection from wild animals, shelter and protection from other people coming after them on the sea who might be jealous of what they already had achieved. So the first thing they looked at was a cave. Now, that gave them some security, some protection, and we're starting to get more of a place. You can actually identify that place. You can decorate the walls. Indeed, primitive man did decorate those walls with pictures of things he wanted to own or things he did own or animals he wanted to kill. But the problem with a cave, of course, is it's very accessible from the one direction where your enemy is most likely to arrive, from the sea. And, of course, if there's another one of those Norwegian landslides, you might be washed out. So the next thing is to go up the cliffs to higher ground, and preferably find a headland where you've got steep cliffs on three sides and you can be protected from others coming after you, but also you have access to the land, access to your food, access to wild animals. So the headlands tended to be the first places to be developed as places, mainly for defensive reasons. And while we're in West Wales, now that we've come up to the top of the cliff, the next image I want to conjure, and I'm sure you'll have your own comparative images, is of a little rock outcrop in the top of the peninsula that's in David's Head. It's just a volcanic eruption, a very small one, like a tooth, like a large tooth, with a few cracks in it where you can get into the center of this rock defense. And not surprisingly, that was chosen as a strong point and as a home. And Cleggerboya, on the top of the St. David's Peninsula, became a settlement, became a place, a home, for hundreds of years. Indeed, it was the local chieftain who lived there, even in the Middle Ages when they were building St. David's Cathedral, hidden in a valley below the peninsula to protect it from marauding Vikings. The Vikings, by the way, don't come into this picture very often, but I do want you to attribute to them the thing that they really achieved, which was the introduction of mass tourism, with overtones, of course, that mass tourism has. So here we are on the top of the peninsula, protected by raw rock, and we use that as a means of security to create a place. All of these expressions of placemaking are very linked with topography. And it's no surprise that in the country that existed prior to the Romans' arrival, in other words, before the last 2,000 years, the Celtic country, this was a country that was irrevocably linked with topography. Topography was very important and still is to a Celt. Welsh place names are topographical. Now, when I say which is the longest place name in Europe, 63 letters. No, I don't think it is 63 letters. I'll have to count them afterwards. It is the longest, I can assure you. That place name is purely descriptive. It's the Church of St. Mary in a hollow of the white hazel, near to the whirlpool, close to St. Cecilias Church of the Red Cave. All that in one place name. So you don't need postcards from Llanfair PG. You've got it in the name. The full description is there. And you can see how important it was to the Celts to describe place, to identify with the features of place, to be part of place. In the pagan religion, there was religious significance to groups of trees, especially oak trees, and to, I suppose, what you'd call an early predecessor of the Chinese feng shui, the importance of location and proximities and alignments. So there we are in Wales, looking at defensive homesteads, looking at the importance of identifying with the landscape, and we have a culture that is living generally on high ground. They didn't have the tools necessary to cultivate the valleys, which were wooded and wet, so they were up on the high ground, grazing animals and growing crops as best they could. And that was very much the way things were, as I said, all the way through until the Roman invasion. Now, while we leave West Wales, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to bring some excess baggage with you, because we're now heading east, and I want you to bring some rather large lumps of rock from the top of the local mountain in Pembrokeshire, from the Preseli Hills, and we'll see what they're necessary for in a moment. We're now heading east. No Severn Bridge, so you'll have to swim. And we're crossing the high ground of southern England, heading towards the Thames. On our right, we pass an amazing structure. standing on a hilltop. Oh, and by the way, those stones you've brought have been very useful because they've been used already. We've created Stonehenge with those lumps of rock from Pembrokeshire. Now, why on earth would primitive man drag stone all that way across South Wales, across the Bristol Channel, up onto the high ground to create Stonehenge? Well, it must have been a very powerful need to do that, because they were having to do that with very, very primitive tools, rolling them on logs. Heaven knows how they floated them across water, but they got them there. And the reason was because, as far as we're aware, and this is the latest theory, there are many others, Stonehenge was a hospital. It was a place of healing. It was a place that captured the power of the surroundings. It was a topographically significant point. So, to primitive man, it was worth the effort of bringing those stones from an area that they had inhabited earlier, which had great significance to them, bringing them to create this temple. And that is very much a place, that is a focus, that is a point on the earth where primitive man believed that somehow power was focused to be able to do good, to be able to cure people. I know there are alternative explanations that it might have been something to do with reading the stars, it might have been mathematical, it might have done all sorts of things, but the latest theory seems to be a hospital. Whatever the theory, it was to do with focusing something at a particular point on the earth and giving it significance. So here we start to see just how deeply place plays a part in the psyche of early man. And that, like it or not, has stayed with us. That has stayed with us to the present. We probably don't even know how powerful the need for place is in our minds, but we still have those feelings subliminally within our minds. So let's carry on down the Thames, and the journey gets quicker now because we're travelling by water. We head down the Thames, and we come to a point where the river is deep enough to bring a boat up from the sea. The Romans, 2,000 years ago, sailed up the river. Drunken and sex-starved, they ran aground at the point where there was luckily 2 low hills on the north bank of the River Thames. As far as they could get up the River Thames, the south bank was marshes and islands and mud and despair. And you've been to South London, haven't you? Anyway, in those days, only the north bank was clear of the water because of those 2 very low hills. One of them is where St. Paul's now stands. The other is where they built the Roman Forum, which is today called Ludgate Hill. Sorry. I'm sorry. St. Paul's is on Ludgate Hill, and the other is Cornhill. The Forum stood on Cornhill. So 2 hills, 1 city, Roman civilization. A place was built. Nothing to do with topography other than the fact that it was above water. The Romans came in with their engineers' minds, and they established a grid iron city. They planned it. It was a theoretically, classically planned place. Totally different from anything the Celts would have done. They would have said, well, what's the religious significance of this place before they would even have thought of making it a centre. But the Romans established a city at that point. And from then on, it looked as if London's history would develop along classical lines. What would have happened if it had? Well, let's think about that. There have been attempts to plan London over the years. As a planner, I'm pleased to say they've all failed. The Romans managed it, and then a previous Welsh city planning officer called Boudicca burnt it all down. I'm not the first Welsh city planning officer, I'm the second. She had her way with classical architecture, but unfortunately, she lost the battle in the end, and although she burnt down the city, it was rebuilt. When the Romans departed, the city fell into decay. When the Saxons came to London, they didn't bother with the Roman city. They established a settlement in the Aldwych. Some say they founded the LSE, although I very much doubt that. And then the Vikings came in and stirred everything round a bit. Things became a bit more unsettled. And later, the Vikings who had settled in France and learnt to drink wine, now known as the Normans, arrived and invaded the country. Or at least, they invaded all of the country except for one very special place, and that was the city of London. The Normans never invaded the city. They built a castle at the Tower of London, another castle upstream at Puddle Dock, and they kept a good eye on it because they realized it was a real earner. Even in those days, it was a thriving metropolis. And to this day, of course, that means that the king or queen of this country has no right to enter the city of London. If the Queen wants to go into the city, her car or her carriage has to stop in Fleet Street, and she has to wait until the Lord Mayor turns up with his sword of office, which he places on the floor of the vehicle, and she can then proceed into the city, because the city is under separate control. A very peculiar place, but a very special place. A place to which I'm very closely attached because I was lucky enough to spend 29 years of my life as the chief planner for the city. And that reinforced in my mind the magic of the place. As a place, it is based on gossip. And that is why most people go to places most often. If you're in the middle of a desert, you need a water hole. But you need a water hole for two reasons. The first is, of course, that you need water. But the second, and probably more important reason, is that you need the latest news. And you go to the water hole to collect water, and you also collect the hot gossip, which you can take home to your house to exchange with your family. The City of London is no different. It's no more sophisticated than that. The City of London is a centre point of gossip. That has been the way for 2,000 years. It has a continuous trading history of 2,000 years. The Romans set it up to be an import-export centre, to bring in products from the Mediterranean and take out products from this country. That was the reason for establishing it in the first place. And trading has continued there for a continuous period of 2,000 years. So trading and business has soaked into the stone of the city. You can sense it when you're there, when you walk through little medieval alleyways and past pubs where people are still gossiping in the way they did in the Middle Ages when banking started in pubs in the city. People would go to a pub in the city to borrow money from a rich merchant who happened to be sitting in the pub, and that was his regular haunt. He would sit in a corner. If you wanted to borrow money, you would talk to your friends, and your friends would say, "We know somebody who might lend you money. Come with us, we'll take you down to the pub, and we'll introduce you to a rich merchant." You'd go to the pub. Your friends would stand surety for you, and if the rich merchant liked the look of you, he would lend you money for your endeavour. The banking started in pubs in the Middle Ages in the city. And to this day, bank signs are pub signs. The logos of the banks are pub signs. Barclays at the sign of the spread eagle. Lloyd's at the sign of the black horse. In fact, Barclays and Lloyd's both started in Lombard Street, right in the heart of the city. And if you go down Lombard Street today, you'll actually see pub signs, or what look like pub signs, hanging off classical buildings. They're not pub signs, but they're the signs of the Lombard banks of the 12th century, when the Lombards came over from northern Italy to establish modern banking in London and picked up on the medieval clue of pubs to identify their banks. So there we have the birthplace of the logo of business in the City of London as an identifier for a point where you will get hot information. All the way through 2,000 years of history, that's been true. And if you go to the city today, near to the Bank Junction, you'll see a very large building site in Queen Victoria Street. And that construction is the European headquarters, the new European headquarters for Bloomberg, the largest collector of business data and gossip on the planet. They know where they need to be for the hottest business gossip, right in the heart of the city. Not at Canary Wharf, not in Paris, not in Frankfurt, but right in the heart of the city. Because to this day, that is how business is facilitated. Not just in the shiny towers that we see rising in the city, in the cluster of towers like the Gherkin and the Cheese Grater and the Walkie-Talkie, but in those medieval alleyways, in the little pubs and the restaurants. 2 years ago, I had a group of school children, 9-year-olds from Cumbria, from the Scottish border, Their headmistress had seen me doing something on the television and had emailed me and said her children were coming to London. Would I talk to them because they were fascinated by the cluster of towers in the city? They were fascinated by this different place. Now, these were children that had never been further than Carlisle in their lives, and they were coming to London. She must have been an amazing teacher because she'd arranged for them to meet their MP at the House of Commons. They were going to choral evensong in St Paul's Cathedral. They were going to Tate Modern. And the downside was they were coming to see me. And I had to think, how on earth do I explain to a group of 9-year-olds the workings of the City of London, this extraordinary place? They came into the marketing suite at the Guildhall, and I had in front of me a large model of the whole of the city with the models of the towers in the city at one end, and their eyes popped open to see this wonderful model. It was just like a giant train set to them. And I said, right, now then, who's going to volunteer? I said, which of you can explain to me how the city works? Didn't know what to do. I said, all right, I'll give you an easier question. Who can explain to me how a beehive works? Oh, the hands all went up. They all knew about beehives. They had them in their village. They'd seen them being opened. They'd gone and stood while the honey was taken out of the beehives. And I said, right, well, the City of London is exactly the same. Those towers, the gherkin, the walkie-talkie, and the cheese grater, those are beehives. But inside those beehives, we don't have bees, we have bankers. And they don't make money, they make honey. Now then, who can tell me how honey is made? Bees fly out and they collect nectar from flowers. Exactly, I said. The bankers fly out into the little alleyways and go into the pubs and the restaurants for nectar. Now, what happens when a bee is collecting nectar? They brush up against the inside of the flower and they collect pollen, which they take to other flowers. I said, exactly. Now, that's the gossip they pick up. I was really heartened a few days later when I received a card after they'd returned home to Cumbria. And on the card, they'd done a drawing of bees, or bankers rather, in pinstripe suits with wings on their back, flying out of the towers down into the little alleyways. And I thought, well, they've got the message. But the reason for telling the story is that 9-year-olds can understand how the City of London works. It's not sophisticated, it's not complicated. It's entirely about bringing a lot of people together in one place where they can have ideas, where they can eavesdrop, and where they can make money. Now, another reason that our place works particularly well in terms of gossip is the idea of the British pub. A British pub is wonderful for business and for gossip in a way that a French cafe can never be. Let's compare the two. In a French cafe, you sit at a table with your friends. You talk to your friends, you hear your friends' news, you exchange gossip with your friends. Nearby, there's another table with people you don't know talking about their news and their gossip. Now, because of the way that the cafe is arranged and the fact that you're stuck at your table with your friends, you can't quite hear what the next table is saying. But you're desperate to, because other people's news is always more interesting than your own. But in those circumstances, you cannot eavesdrop on other people's news. The only news you're going to get is the news of your friends that you probably know anyway. Now then, in an English pub, you stand up to drink. You're in amongst your group of friends, you talk to them about their news, and there will be another group nearby talking about different news. And after you've had a few beers, you find your group has got larger and perhaps moving about a little bit more, and you find yourself very close to the people in the next group. In fact, you might even have found yourself in the next group if you've had quite a few pints, and you start to overhear what they have to say. Now, in the City of London, of course, that's worth millions, because you might just put together two pieces of a jigsaw that make a good business deal. And you can rush back to the office after lunch, if you can remember what you heard, and make a fortune out of it. I always tell students when I walk them through the Royal Exchange in the centre of the city, through that wonderful coffee bar in the great space near to the Bank Junction, that if any of them are lip readers, they stand to make a fortune. Because in that space, you have people sitting down having meetings they wouldn't have in the office. Meetings they don't want the boss to hear. Maybe they're looking for a better job, so they go out and have a quiet meeting. Maybe they're doing a business transaction with somebody that doesn't even have an office these days and simply works off their laptop and their mobile. They will use a space like that for exchanging information, for doing business. So you see that the place and the health of the place and the strength of the place has little to do with grand architecture, but everything to do with points where people can come together and exchange information. That's why I came up with the formula, and there's only one formula today, you'll be pleased to know. When I came in, that whole screen was covered with mathematical formulae, and it's a shame it was wiped off, because I was going to say to all of you, you'd have to memorize it by the end of the lecture. That's gone, but I will give you one formula. Very simple, it's the title of the talk. Places equals spaces plus people. Places are not made by planners or architects. They're made by the people that inhabit the spaces. If an architect and a planner can make a good space of the right proportions, accessible, permeable, with the right mixture of uses around it, people will gather there. And once people gather there, it becomes a place. But it's arrogant of planners and architects to think that they're making the places. It depends on the involvement of people, of a community, to create that place. That's as true in the City of London as it is in any new town. And I'm sure we can all have a picture in our minds of a new town. If I just say two words, Milton Keynes, you'll have your equivalent, but you can know of a place. I use that word loosely because maybe it isn't a place, but you can know of a settlement, a development that has been created by architects and planners with the intention of housing people. And you can know that within those neighbourhoods, there will be spaces that haven't come alive, spaces that don't seem to have a human or social purpose, because they haven't been designed with people in mind. They don't provide the right opportunities for people. In the mid-1980s, there was a huge transformation in the City of London when financial services were deregulated and it was necessary to rebuild large parts of the city. One of the first areas to be rebuilt was the area around Liverpool Street Station at Broadgate. And the greatest satisfaction I got out of being involved in that project was that Broadgate Circus, the circular space where they have the ice rink in winter and street theatre in the summer, that space attracted more people in its second week of opening than any space in the city had ever attracted. It became the city's most popular space. The public proved that the design was a good one. So if we think more about creating good spaces, in other words, making a really good, interesting, tasty cake, then we can let the architects come along afterwards and produce nice buildings around it, which is like putting the icing on the cake. But there's no good having great icing if you've got a rotten cake. Get the cake right first, and that's the job of us planners working with the community, and then we can ice it afterwards and make it even more impressive. But let's get the ingredients right first. All sorts of things are threatening London at the moment. Having an elected mayor, in my opinion, is a bad idea. I used to think that elected mayors had no use at all. All they do is change the buses, build cable cars that go nowhere, and then piss off to Uxbridge. But I've changed my mind, because ever since I've seen Boris dangling on that zip wire, I begin to realise they do make wonderful Christmas decorations. So they do have a use after all. The other great threat, of course, are these piles of safe deposit boxes being built all along the River Thames, these empty apartments that are being built for footloose international capital, some of it of dubious provenance. That's another threat to London that we've got to address. So after we've decided we don't want another elected mayor, we can set about making London less attractive for bad capital. Otherwise, rather than having a capital skyline, we will just have a skyline of capital. I would now like to hear what you think. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter Rees. We have time for questions, and we have some microphones coming around. So if you have a question, put up your hand and wait for...
There are a couple in the royal box at the back.
A microphone, yes. There's a question up here in the box, if you can reach.
Thank you for that magnificent address. There's 2 points I'd like to make. It's very interesting that Occupy use public spaces to make their political points, and most effectively, and especially outside St. Paul's, where they dangled people on a string for quite some time and made good points. with the support, I may say, of Tony Benn, late Tony Benn. And the other point that I've found very interesting that you raised, but don't quite know how to express it, is the powerful elite who take great gaps of land. I think towards the end you were saying it was bad capital, but also they make a rotten cake, because when they have these large expanses of land and they're isolated, that, you know, there's no interest for them and no interest for anybody else. But I don't quite know how you would put that in a more esoteric way, if you could. Thank you.
I'll do my best. First of all, yes, the point about Occupy, people need space to protest, they need space to point out what's going wrong in society. And I'm very proud that Occupy were able to occupy space in the City of London, right in front of St. Paul's Cathedral, in a very prominent location.
And can I just say, I was the one that built the library with a guy called Nathan outside there, the Occupy library.
Well done. And I'm pleased that that was able to take place. And people have said, oh yes, but they were swept away. And I do point out the only reason that the city had to intervene was at the point when it was developing considerable social problems with drug addiction and homeless children and all sorts of other things that couldn't be allowed to continue. But there was no attempt to stop the free expression. People also point out, but they wanted to be in Paternoster Square, and that was private land, and that had been privatized space. And I point out that, no, that had never been public open space. It was always private land, but there was space in public nearby where this could take place. Now, the other point you were making was the one about the private land around developments. Two kinds of housing. High-end apartment buildings for the international investment market tend to be built as skyscrapers in the middle of a plot of land. They're sold in Hong Kong to people who only want to know what is the view from the window and how high a floor am I on. So they want the buildings to be vertical. But when you build towers, you build them in the middle of the site and you leave space all around, which is useless. That space can't be used by people. It's on the back edge of a busy road. It's not attractive. And anyway, people probably don't want they probably won't let the public onto the land around this private building. If you want to achieve new space in a housing development, then I suggest you do what the Greater London Council were doing in the 1970s in Vauxhall Bridge Road at a lovely estate called Lillington Gardens. It's worth going to have a look. Red brick estate, 6 to 8 stories high, no higher, with a wonderful space in the middle. The development is built around the street edges of the block, and there's a space in the middle with mature trees and plenty of grass, and people look out into that space and share the space. It's like having jam in the middle of a donut. That is much higher density accommodation than will ever be achieved in tower blocks. Because when you build tower blocks, you've got to spread them further apart to let in the daylight and sunlight. So it's a myth that you have to build tall to house people in London. And also, in doing so, you're not only creating empty buildings that are just piles of safe deposit boxes, you're also creating waste space around the buildings. And I assume that's the kind of space you were talking about. We need to be able to move away from that. The best spaces are generally small spaces, and they're usually and almost always contained within buildings, so people can actually go in and get away from the hurly-burly of London. Do you have another topic, please?
There's a question here.
How does technology alter or I should say challenge your approach to placemaking? We've transformed the way that people communicate. Obviously, nothing can ever replace face-to-face communication, but given that we can communicate via Google Hangouts or in ways that we never could before, and at rates that we never do, does that at all challenge kind of this overall approach to people and places, or people and spaces make places?
You would think that it would have that effect. And ever since I started in my job replanning the city, journalists have been writing articles saying that in 10 years' time, everybody would be working from home. They wouldn't go to the office. The reason they were saying that is because journalists work at home. But journalists don't get stories at home. If they want a story, they have to go down the pub. And they omit that thought. Most people go to the office because they want to go to the office, because that's where most of their friends are. Increasingly, as the families evaporate and people are broken down into smaller units, the office or the workplace becomes the centre of people's social lives. And that makes offices very productive places. People who work in offices not only work together, they often party together. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to create nightlife in the city to go alongside the office. That's why we now have nightclubs in Cornhill. That's why groups come in and rent spaces in the city on a Saturday night and bring their own parties with them. It's good to have the party and the office close together because that's all part of building a team that will work more efficiently. Equally, socially, you'd think that because people can now be on Facebook and they can order sex by number off a menu, that they wouldn't bother to go out to meet people. But I find in the gay bars of the West End there are just as many people sitting in there as there ever were, although they're probably on Grindr as well. They're probably going through the list at the same time and looking up to see who's around them. So in many ways you could say it's increased their possibilities, but they still want to be at a point with other people where there is action and potential. The virtual world can only ever be a second best. And, you know, we in this lecture theatre are feeling a little sorry for those people who are sitting at home watching this because you guys can only ever have a second best and you can't experience what we're experiencing here. So I don't think the technology is going to do anything other than make cities and places more important. The other thing in financial deals, in business, the more you connect people over the internet, the more they do electronic computations and deals, the more they seem to want to come together to clinch those deals at the end. We don't even realize that, like animals, we can smell fear. We don't know we can, but we can. And that can be the critical component in doing a really good deal, knowing when the other guy is defeated. You can't tell by looking at him, but maybe there's something subliminally. You'll never get that over the electronic media.
One of the things I really love about London is it's so walkable compared to the US. I love all of the passageways between buildings that break up blocks. My question is, some of the newer areas of London that are being developed, are there ways or methods that can be used to preserve those kind of passageways?
Ladies and gentlemen, an American who's learned to walk. Congratulations. No, I agree with you, absolutely. London is a very walkable city. And the city of London, the square mile, is very much focused around that kind of pedestrian permeability, the old alleyways. I'm pleased to say that we haven't lost any of those during the last 30 years. And whenever a large development has come along, the city planners have been very keen to achieve new routes through those sites to create more permeability. Because 90% of all the movements within the square mile are made on foot. The remainder are made by public transport. And it's very important for business activity to be able to get easily from one place to another. That's true of every community, not just the city. I would like to see more of that happening across other parts of London, because there is a danger that as larger and larger sites are developed, space is either not left for people to pass through the sites or else is privatized and gated. And I always despair when I see that. It's not even good for security. The best thing for security is people. And having people in a place, that will make a place much more secure. So yes, I'm all for more walking around London. It's the best place to appreciate it. It's even better than cycling, because you can't dare look around you when you're cycling. But walking is the best place and the best way and the only way, in my opinion, to appreciate it. So yes, we'll fight that one together.
We have time for one more question, very short, and a short answer as well. This is you first, sir.
Thank you. I was interested in your conversation about Lillington Gardens, Darbourne and Dark.
Yep.
And do you not feel that in some ways the way that capital is now funding housing development rather than local authorities is part of the reason that that's actually changed? And how can capital-funded projects be led back towards things like World's End, Lillington Gardens, Maiden Lane, those sort of projects, which were all mainly done by local authority or as a local authority initiative?
I don't think it has to be publicly funded, but I do think we've got to move away from this dream of universal home ownership in London back towards a large, professionally managed rental sector with good tenant safeguards. Paris, Vienna, Berlin function much better with most people renting rather than buying. It's a much more efficient use of land because people who rent generally use the apartment. People who buy will often keep it empty purely as an investment. So I think if we're going to get back to high-density housing to meet the needs of Londoners, then we've got to move away from this stupid British myth of trying to achieve universal home ownership. You can be a stakeholder in society and rent a home and actually have a much happier life. The Germans do. Most of Europe does. Why can't we?
Thank you very much.